Thank you for coming together. This is our round table, even though it's a square table. It is a table that brings together a group of people who really represent a wide range of what this commission is going to grapple with as we move forward on the BRAIN initiative. And I'd like to simply start off the roundtable with a question that I often ask at our roundtable. It's a question that requires you to prioritize and just hone in on one single issue that you think is most in greatest need of the Bioethics Commission attention as we consider the ethics of neuroscience research and the potential applications of the results of that research. And I'll begin here and work way down for one single issue. Dr. Casebeer.
Thanks, Dr. Gutman. On the procedural side, I think the single most important issue is pedagogic. So how are we going to surface the resident expertise, both in the engineering and the scientific communities and in the ethics communities, and bring it together to provide rational guidance for the research? So how are we going to do that procedurally? And then the second issue, and I know this is a little bit of a dodge in your question, is substantive. And that relates to how are we going to take into account the context in which the research funded by various agencies is done. And I raise that just because, especially in DARPA circles, we have a defense mission, which I think is somewhat different from the clinical model.
Yeah, I'd agree that, to me, I think the highest priority is education. So I would agree with William that that education of the scientists. I think we're going to enter new areas where the scientists are going to be looking to bioethicists like they have never before. So I think that's important in the public as well. I think the one thing I would say is that if I was a mouse, I would be really worried because pretty soon somebody's going to know everything about my brain.
So is
Luckily,
that
I'm a human.
scientifically true that if you were a mouse, you would actually be worried?
No, absolutely true. I think that's where there are really going to be big changes in the lower organisms. I think as being a human, I think we have time to kind of do this, and it's not going to be like the Genome Project where bang, someday it all lays out in front of you. This is going to be very kind of incremental as far as the human is concerned. But I think the animal work is going to move very, very quickly now.
Okay. So we should be concerned on the ethics of imposing pain on animals.
No, I think that's true, but I was actually
I'm
thinking...
asking.
No,
I'm asking because it isn't, as far as I know, mice don't worry, but they do. We know that they experience pain.
Yes. No, I was saying somewhat facetiously to Nina's.
I'm not being facetious now.
Right.
I want to know.
No, I think,
Okay.
I think that's a very concrete example of which people could stimulate brain cells inside the brain to create a pain, something that's experienced as pain. How would we know about it? How do we deal?
Okay.
But the bigger issue is, I think, we will understand in a way which you never before how a brain is working in these lower organisms, and that is that I think is what is going to foretell what will happen in humans, but over a longer period of time.
Thank you. Dr. Johnson.
Not an easy question, so I've been scrambling here. So I think what I want to say is, it's going to be odd, I think the emphasis should be on and I'm thinking of the technologies that are going to be developed, not the research itself. I want to say the emphasis, there should be a great deal of attention given to the social relations constituted by those technologies. I mean, I know it's odd and abstract, but I think ethical issues are always embedded in a social context. And so what I'm saying is a lot of attention should be paid to in a way, it's uses, but it's really who, how, who, you know, who's impacted, how, and because the knowledge is knowledge is not disembodied, it's social relations.
Dr. Murray, thank you.
Although we may be able to anticipate some major categories of future challenges, we cannot anticipate the particulars. And so we need to prepare in the best way possible to be able to handle the surprises that will inevitably come upon us, just as they did in the Genome Project. And we've talked about ways of doing that, creating a basis of fundamental scholarship, creating communities of interdisciplinary communities of scholars, educating scientists and helping the public. So, but I would say that's the fundamental thing I care about.
Proactively prepare for right now, the unknowable developments in the future, to be prepared for them. Yeah.
Lay the groundwork for...
Proactively prepare for the incidental findings, which will not be incidental, actually, but there, yeah. Just heard what Chris said. Dr. Chatterjee.
As an aside, I have a colleague who quips that it's a great time to be a mouse, because if you have a disease, we probably know how to cure it. But separate from that, I think, going back to where I ended my talk, I think public education, for me, seems to be a really critical thing, and one we haven't probably paid enough attention to. And I think this is a way in which education actually loops back into a kind of regulation, but not in a formal sense. So it is probably the case that everybody here who buys a book on Amazon goes on it and then reads other people's reviews. These are people you don't know, and you read them and you try to decide whether this makes sense to you. If you get a hotel, you maybe go on TripAdvisor and do the same sorts of things. I think we need an engaged public that has opinions and are confident about their opinions. And so if someone says, we're going to do a SPECT scan in a way to guide your marriage therapy, which people are doing out there, you have a public that says this just doesn't make any sense, and they feel confident about that, and the only way to do that is to have them educated in the basic inferences that you can make from neuroscience data.
Thank you. And that's a pair with something Dr. Murray said earlier about using the new technology. The flip side of that is it's a lot harder to get the public's attention these days because they're flooded with information overload, but definitely something that this commission is at the heart of our sense of our mission has to do with the education. So very helpful. Dr. Chalmers.
I suppose I think that one of the most important issues here has to be privacy, just because the mind is traditionally such a private domain, and this is something which has the potential to be completely transformed by the kind of neuroscience technology that might come out of the BRAIN initiative. I mean, here I think a contrast with the Genome Project is useful. Of course, there are issues about privacy come up very much in the Genome Project, along with a number of other related ethical issues, but there are also some differences. I mean, one difference is, of course, that there's so much more we don't understand in the case of the brain, that the technological and theoretical challenges are much greater, and the project is more open-ended, and the framework is longer. But another important difference, though, is the Genome Project is basically mapping something static, and although it's something of very deep personal concern, it's this it's a genome which is sort of built into you for life. The BRAIN initiative, if it comes off, is basically mapping something completely dynamic. The moment by moment state of the brain, and ultimately, if it all works out, the moment by moment state of the mind. And I think that takes issues about privacy to a whole new level, probably well beyond those raised by, say, the Genome Project.
Dr. Wingfield.
Yes, first of all, I agree with everything that's been said so far, but there's one thing I'd really like to add, and that's open access. As you probably know, the Office of Science, Technology and Policy asked the funding agencies to start developing plans for open access, and those details will be forthcoming, I think. But of course, This relates to taxpayers' money paid for this, then it should be open to all. And the NIH and USDA have been doing this with publications for some time, but this open access will also include data that go along with those.
So this actually, there's bookends here because the concern of Dr. Casebeer of being context specific and the
Yes.
open access may be in tension.
Yeah, and I think it addresses issues of privacy, but also it brings in dual-use research of concern. That whole issue began with the H5N1
All right.
paper and the data. Should the techniques be released? Should the data be released? Because there is the possibility that others could use them for nefarious purposes. And that's going to be a huge issue as we develop further on in the future.
Thank you all. I have a group of questions from the audience, and I also want to give commission members, and I see, I'm going to alternate. I'm going to begin with Dan Slamacy, go to a question from the audience, go to Raju, go to Anita, and intersperse it with at least a few of the questions we've gotten from the audience and any others that come up. So Dan, why don't you begin?
Thanks. I wanted to follow up on Amy's questions about animal ethics, actually, which several of you brought up. And I just wonder what the state of sort of the neuroethics of animal research is. Obviously, we talk about not causing animals pain, but we're engaging, I think, in a set of experiments in which we'll be altering perceptions, memories, behavior, creating lesions, doing these implants and other stimulators in animals. And I just wonder whether there's a literature on this. Well, we're familiar with not causing animals pain, but what about changing their minds?
This is not my field of expertise, although I do try to monitor the animal ethics literature. And there is an extant literature on this topic. So there are several authors writing in the area of animal experimentation. The traditional Millian notion of sentience and what obligations we owe to other creatures by dint of the fact that they can experience the phenomenology of pain is relatively well explored. I remember, in fact, having a very interesting conversation with a cadet at the Air Force Academy one time about whether or not fish feel pain and whether that influenced whether he wanted to put out fishing as a hobby on his Rhodes Scholarship application, for instance. So those are, I think, conversations that have been dwelled upon in the literature. In the great apes especially, there is an applied ethics literature that has looked at the judgment decision-making capabilities of these creatures, and I know there is a movement afoot to recognize that they have some form of agency that disturbs moral respect in the Kantian sense as well.
But literature about changing those sorts of things, not just about pain. In the sense of changing perceptions, changing memory, changing orientation, which are things that are going to happen in animals faster than they will in humans. Is there a sort of literature on those things?
Dr. Wingfield wanted to take that up.
The Institute of Laboratory Animal Research at the National Academies has a journal, and it's devoted to all aspects of laboratory animal research, but some of these debates can be found there.
Let me take a question from Nina Mack. Nina, where are you? Can you raise your hand? Thank you very much. She's a program consultant for Alternatives Research and Development Foundation. And Nina asks, do we need to also consider the ethical implications of the research agenda itself? For example, what research is funded or prioritized, where, how, when, why research money is allocated, not just which mental functions or disorders are studied, but also which models are used. How much should be devoted to animal research versus human research versus development of new technologies to facilitate and advance human research?
Well, the answer is yes. I mean, yeah,
Okay.
we should bear all of that in mind. But a small distinction here, though. There are ethical implications everywhere, but science policy decisions are not usually driven by, in a narrow sense, ethical implications, but very much driven by value, the values that we regard as most important to pursue and value priorities. So the answer is yes for those
Good.
reasons.
Raju?
Amy, I want to make a couple of observations, and that they may or may not be accurate, and I want to, based upon those observations, I want to pose a question to all of our members. First of all, this is extraordinary that the President of the United States would actually ask the Commission for Bioethics to study the implications of ethical issues for a new research initiative. To my knowledge, this has never happened before. So that's number one. The second observation that I want to make is that I think that I have to confess that the communities that we're talking about, the scientists, engineers, and the ethical scholars, they don't know each other. And we were talking about this stuff, and I was part of the Human Genome Project. I was part of the National Advisory Council for Human Genome Research for 6 years, and I knew about the LC program. But I bet you don't know me, and I don't know you. Okay, and right, I'm part of the Human Genome Project, and we spent $1 billion to do that, and I don't know you. Right, this is the first time I met you. So there's something fundamentally wrong about this, right? So I mean, you talked about, Hastings Center and how we're going to be able to bring all of these people and so on and so forth. I know Hastings Center, I know some of the work, but the communities are different. So everybody, we knew, like in the Human Genome Project, LC gets 5% of the money, and all of the people that get funded, they do what they're doing. We in the Human Genome Project, we were mapping and sequencing the human genome by ourselves. And the same thing happens everywhere, right? Or think a little bit more about that. With the NHGRI has an LC program. To my knowledge, there is no such similar LC programs to the other institutes of the National Institutes of Health, right? They don't exist. So there is an opportunity here. I think that as we think about this, we're sitting in this room to think about this, we might be able to reshape this. If we all truly believe that the way to be able to accomplish this goal of really educating everybody and thinking about these ethical principles right from the beginning, we got to think about ways in which, at the beginning of this effort, that we need to bring all the people together. And some of you have addressed this issue, and how do we do that?
So
That's the question.
So could I just say, and I want to call on Nita because she wants to say something to this as well. The two observations you made, I think, are intimately connected as part of the recommendation, which is President Obama did see fit to ask the Bioethics Commission at the very beginning of funding and exploring intensely the BRAIN Initiative to be part of this. And he brought us together, so I and our executive director were there at the launch with the I was there with the heads of the other agencies, and we were there at the launch of this. So that's both real, practically speaking and symbolically speaking, a very important statement. And then I just add one other thing, and then I'm going to turn it to Nita. We as a commission are constituted quite distinctly from some other commissions in that we have Raju and scientists, Stephen and others, you know, on the commission, along with people whose specialty is, you know, different forms of practical ethics. So I think what you've called for is not only called for, but is practically possible and ethically justified. And I will turn it over to Nita for her comments.
So I wanted to comment about how some of the ways in which I've observed the neuroscience community to be quite different than the experience that you've had, Raju, because it's one of the things that I've found most interesting in my work in neuroethics is how many of the neuroscientists and people in the field of neuroethics really actually do know one another and have developed a community, and how inclusive the neuroscientists have been from the get-go of individuals involved in ethics. So just a few examples. There's the International Neuroethics Society, which is headed by a neuroscientist, but the board, which I'm also on, has quite a few people who come from each of the different disciplines. The Society for Neuroscience, at their annual meeting, features the David Kopf Lecture, which has regularly 20,000 plus people who attend to hear an ethics conversation. There's been countless TV shows like the PBS show that's coming out on Brains on Trial, bringing together neuroscientists, neuroethicists, philosophers. Steve's center at USC actively engaging both neuroethicists as well as neuroscientists. The Duke Institute for Brain Sciences, Brain and Society initiatives at Harvard, at Stanford, each of these different places have been actively engaged with neuroethicists. And that isn't to say there isn't far more that can be done, but there's been a real interest and commitment by this community to make ethics part of the conversation and integrate it from day one. And so that encourages me to think that there's a real opportunity here and a real distinction here from other past approaches at integrating the two.
And I want to just emphasize that the opportunity part, because we can't take for granted that as the field develops, it will continue to be so integrated. In fact, it won't unless there are institutions, practices set up to make this happen. And the purpose of it isn't to just have lots of diverse people with different expertise getting together. The purpose is to make sure that the practice of neuroscience moving forward is scientifically and ethically sound. And so this is, if nothing else comes out of this morning's session, then our commitment to make recommendations to further this kind of productive integration and collaboration, I think we will have had a very productive morning. Please.
Quick follow-up comment. I think that, the fact that we have diversity among the presidential commission members, that's great, but I'm trying to get at something different. I'm maybe to make a specific suggestion. What I'm saying is that when we actually award money for a project to develop new technologies in neuroscience or any other area, is that the time when we should also embed within that a person or a group or somebody who's knowledgeable about the kinds of issues, so that it is not post facto that you think about this, but during the work that you'd actually be engaged in that conversation, and whether that is a good thing.
So my answer, I can't speak yet for the commission, is yes. So, and that's, I do want to, yeah, but in the interest of, I want to get a question from the audience. Otherwise, we're going to squeeze out these really excellent questions, which I don't want to do. So Tom will get back to you. But Karen Gallinari, Karen, where are you? Who's the Director of Regulatory Affairs for Research at Montefiore Medical Center. And Karen's question is as follows. Should this commission develop some policy which drills down to details such as forbidding memory control technology to prevent appreciation or recollection of future violent acts, or should it simply articulate only more general guidance and rely upon agencies such as NSF and DARPA to develop policies to prevent harmful uses of neurotechnology. Since we could, as a commission, we're going to have to deliberate, might be good for one of the agents, the people who are actually in the agencies to answer from your perspective. Anyone want to? Okay, Dr. Casebear?
We have a multi-pronged, multi-level problem we have to tackle here. So I don't see it as being an either or. So I think on the one hand, we need education and training for the practitioners. And that education and training has to take seriously the expertise resident in the applied ethics community, but also the expertise and natural savviness of the scientific community. And I think that has to complement whatever transparent and democratic oversight mechanisms are put in place to ensure that native education is applied well in the scientific domain. So it's a multi-level problem. I don't think it's an either or.
Dr. Murray, did you have Dr. Wingfield for this?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that as these new technologies develop and we get a new insight in exactly what it is we're doing and how we're going to do it, then I think is the time to consider the ethical implications of that, and again, open access, to what extent the data should be released in that. In relation to those kinds of technologies is something we're going to have to address.
So I wanted to give Dr. Murray a chance to come back to the previous, what you wanted to say, but I just wanted to make sure to get in some of these more specific, excellent questions. Yeah.
Thanks. So I'm sorry we didn't get to know each other through the Genome Project, Raju. I think I would have enjoyed that very much. But I think Amy's summary was incredibly on point. My most intense time was at the beginning, and it was at that point a very open, vibrant community. The boundaries were less important. So I know many of the leading scientists in the first 5 years or so have become good friends of mine. Victor McCusick and I were very close. And I think from what Nita said, it's great to see that seems to be happening here. But Amy's right. Keeping that vibrancy and those contacts alive is going to require a lot of creativity, a lot of effort, including some institutional pressures that keep it going. So, and I think we should be creative and open-minded about the best ways to accomplish that, experiment with lots of ways, but I thoroughly endorse what you said.
And Raju has one very specific recommendation that we should consider about how to continue that going. Dr. Chatterjee.
Just piggybacking on that, I think what I'm going to say is obvious but should be said, which is that the pressures, if you're a scientist, is to run your lab, right? And that's a very specific enterprise, and that's what you get rewarded for, which means that you don't go out and talk to other people because that's pro bono work, right? So what you need to do is advance your science, and our institutions are set up to promote that and not cross-disciplinary engagement.
Let's make a real quick comment to the last question that came. I think one thing that I would anticipate is that the sticky problems are going to be coming to human studies committees. And they're individual at different institutions. There's a lot of variability. So one potential concrete thing that could happen is to develop a way in which these questions, this education of these human studies committees could occur.
Good. Anita had a question.
In some ways, my question relates to the last audience member's questions about are we going to be drilling down into specifics or operating at a level of generality. I've been worrying about mental health all morning, and so I was particularly struck by Dr. Chatterjee's arresting image of the 50-year-old woman in the hospital in neurology who's manic, who has papers scattered around her room, who's scribbling all over her body, because a lot of us think, oh, bipolar or schizophrenia, but it's not that. It's encephalitis, and now we know this because we know more about the brain, right? And I wondered whether in telling that anecdote, you were in a way suggesting that the ultimate translation of the BRAIN project will be that conditions that we now think of as one sort of thing about which we can do very little are actually something else about which we can do a lot. And this raises, in a general way for me, concerns about how the public will address mental health applications of new brain science. It's a huge public health problem. Some studies say 25% of all Americans suffer from some kind of mental condition every year. It's affecting workplace productivity, family function, criminal justice issues, education success. And yet, we don't have a really good understanding of how to deal with those problems. And yet the science may hold the promise of enabling us to fix the problems if people will undergo the right kind of brain stimulation or take the right drugs. How much coercion will we allow? How much mandate will we allow to fix these problems in ways that involve sort of circumventing the self? And so I guess my question is about, to Dr. Chowdhury, were you actually intending to make the kind of point that I was hearing you make? And would you agree that the commission, if it were going to start to drill down, maybe should drill down on the ethical implications for mental health care and policy of the BRAIN project?
I think part of the reason for using that true example is that it is as vivid as it is, and most people hearing that description wouldn't realize that this is something that we have a particular condition, the phenomenology of which you might see on a psychiatric ward, but in this case is something that is treatable, and we have some understanding of its treatment, of the approaches where this person can be brought back into a relatively normal state. It is the case that if you look across the spectrum of what's going on right now, if you take Alzheimer's disease, depression, bipolar disorder, addiction, that these are the scourges of this era in a way that 150 years ago, instead of talking about Alzheimer's disease, we would have been talking about neurosyphilis, but we don't talk about that, right? It's over and done for the most part, except for some very specific instances. So I am hopeful that some of these things will be addressed and will be treated, and they won't be even thought of as societal problems. But that's not to say that we're there and what's going to happen between now and then and some things that might not be treated. So a more recent example would be that do you consider obesity a disorder or not? Do you restrict how much soda people can be drinking, right? These are the kinds of issues I think that perhaps you're talking about. Which I think are real societal concerns, and part of it is how do you define a disorder, how do you define dysfunction, and whose business is it to modify people's behavior, and how do you go about doing that? And to me, it seems as though until, to use the syphilis analogy, until we have something that just sort of fix it and you move on, this to me seems like part of the issues that commissions like yours have to struggle with, and we in the field have to struggle with.
I really do think that it is an important area, and I think if we do start to drill down, I would like to see us address some of the hard questions around public policy and the use of neuropsychological and neuroimaging and neuroscience in general to address these huge problems. Thanks.
I am going to another question. This one from Celia Sharp in our audience, MBE. Celia, where are you? There you are. Thank you. This is directed, I think, at Dr. Cosper. What percentage of the DARPA project is classified intelligence research, and who is in charge to raise the ethical issues of concern considering the secrecy of the national security? And then no, it's not, doesn't say, ethical, is it disenfranchisement? Is that what the word is? Yeah. I can't read the last word, that's the only thing.
Yeah, like that ethical inconvenience.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. little to no of my work is classified, actually. And most of the programs that I fund are 6-1 work in nature. What that means is that they are basic science work with a publication requirement and total transparency on the results of the program. There is classified work that takes place at DARPA, of course. We do have sensitive compartment information facilities inside of our building, as many Department of Defense facilities do. But I can't give you a good answer with regards to what percentage of our budget consists of classified programs. I just don't know. The larger issue about who is responsible for discharging the work that is done inside the federal government that is secret, I think ultimately, devolves back to our commander-in-chief and what role you think secrecy plays in conducting effective research in an adversarial environment.
Commission members' questions? Yeah.
But if there's another one.
Nita, go ahead, because I actually called on you the last time. You didn't raise your hand.
Sorry. So I wanted to return to something actually that Dr. Chalmers has said in his talk earlier about the extent to which we think that the brain research and brain initiative is going to help us with our basic understandings of concepts like consciousness and self. And you pointed to the Owen study for the minimally conscious state and vegetative state as to whether or not there's some detection of consciousness. And of course, that's come up now in several other studies to see whether or not there's some way we can detect, for example, the difference between perception of pain versus nociception, so actual experience of it or not. And it seems like some of those things actually could be transformative, right? I mean, if we're actually able to see something that looks like a neural signature of the perception of pain as opposed to the registration of pain, then when we talk about things like animal models and see one signal but not the other one, that could be quite powerful. Or, to the extent that people are trying to do it at the end of life or even the beginning of life to try to detect the difference between nociception and perception, these things could really impact a lot of the conversations that we're having. So I was hoping you could elaborate a bit about I agree that there are many philosophical issues that neuroscience simply cannot change. These are normative questions that are layers on top of an analysis on top of it. But it would be helpful to hear from you the ways in which you think neuroscience might actually change the conversation or impact the conversations that we're having in philosophy around concepts of consciousness and self and personhood.
I think philosophy has already begun to be transformed a great deal by the impact of neuroscience and cognitive psychology and computational models of the mind in the last few decades. And I think this very much promises to continue. You mentioned finding things like the neural signature of pain, and I think this kind of thing is potentially has a huge role in applications, as I talked about before. At the same time, there's a delicate interaction between the neuroscience and the philosophy here. I mean, it's not as if neuroscience is just going to come up with the neural signature of pain. We talked about the issue of animal ethics before, and the question, do fish feel pain? Well, exactly that debate is going on right now in the journals. I read a lengthy journal debate in the journal Fish and Fisheries about just this question, with two sides. One saying, look, we find this neural signature of pain in fish, and the other side says, well, no, we don't find this neural signature of pain in fish. And this just raises the question, which is the neural signature of pain? And we don't know that. We know there is a bunch of different things in the brain that correlate with pain, but we don't have a direct measure of pain in the first place. If we just had the consciousness meter that we could come in to extract measure the state of consciousness directly, and then we could more or less find the state of the brain that correlates with it. But in fact, even behavioral studies, our best measure of whether a state is in pain, a system is in pain, is behavioral. And that's very indirect, and it comes up against the traditional philosophical problems of other minds. When it comes to systems like fish and so on, it's not a datum whether the system is in pain or not. So I think what we're actually finding is a delicate interaction between the neuroscience and the philosophy to get at the neural correlative consciousness. Even the neural correlative consciousness, to many scientists, that's already sort of off limits or too hard because consciousness is so subjective and hard to measure. So I think there's room for philosophy and other kinds of foundational thinking, even to get at what's going on with finding these neural signatures. Of course, once we have the neural signatures, then they're going to play back into the philosophy in all kinds of ways. The traditional philosophical problems won't go away. Is pain just the neural signature, or is it something more? But once we actually have the theory in place, then we've got room for something like a scientific attack on the problem of other minds, for example.
Good. I have a question from Sudeep. I can't read your last name. A Penn student, and I'm going to ask Sudeep for you to come and read this because you are deciphering it is beyond my brain or mind's capacity. But I'm sure it's a good question once it gets read. Sudeep, thanks. And you're of the generation that does types on a computer, and
We don't write anymore.
handwriting is not important. So go ahead.
Dr. Murray suggested earlier not to view the Commission's project of education as a knowledge debt problem. We see already that everyone represented here are already having these discussions. They already have bioethics. I like to think of bioethics as something it's not its own distinct field. It works best when informing other fields. Already these conversations are taking place as at agencies, not just scientific agencies, but at family room dining tables. They take place in hospitals, people who are experiencing. We see them on TV shows. How does the Commission incorporate these discussions so as to avoid being viewed as ethical experts with higher recourse to moral knowledge? Or should it claim some sort of moral status higher because of the people who are gathered here today?
Thank you. So let me begin and then have Dr. Murray give his answer. We are constituted by President Obama as a Presidential Commission on Bioethics, independently of any oversight or from a government agency, so as to give advice at our own choosing through our extensive deliberations, but legislatively they must be constituted publicly and open, which we welcome. That's our status. The status of our findings and our reports are only as good as the outcome of those deliberations are. There's something about the process of the deliberation itself that we believe is valuable, which is it is open to the public, it invites public comment, and it demonstrates by our deliberations, and we wish to demonstrate a respect for the wide range of views, including those we ultimately don't come out in agreement with. I think that's a status that's very not only compatible with the best forms of constitutional democracy, but that furthers our constitutional democracy in the realm of working to further, in this case, ethical neuroscience. The rest is we have to work hard, and we do work hard to get reports and recommendations that will live beyond the Commission, both in the quality of the science, the bioethics that we can help inform, and in public education. In public education, Tom, why don't you give your view?
Well, that was a great question, Sudeep, and it's not easy to stand up in front of an audience like this and so articulately ask it, so good work. There's no question that something like skill and practical moral reasoning can be cultivated and can grow, and then some people develop it to a greater extent than others. That doesn't make you a moral expert, but it does enable you to be a very helpful conversation partner for people who are trying to also make sense out of very complex issues. It requires a deep foundation in the relevant facts of the case, and by facts I don't just mean the science, although that's a part of it. It's the science, it's the institutional, political, economic, social factors that shape the question, that all these things matter. These are all part of good practical moral reasoning, knowing all of that. And in the end, I think it's not up to, quote, experts to make the decisions, but it is very much a part of our responsibility to be engaged in these kind of fruitful and open ways with our families, with our communities, and with the public, and with policymakers more broadly. And I'm glad the Commission's doing this work, and I look forward to seeing their recommendations, which I hope will be for a forceful program that will do all those things.
I actually just thanks for that question, because I think it is often misunderstood that when a group is constituted, as we are, to ask the ethical questions, we're no more presumptuous in addressing those than a scientist is in addressing scientific questions, or a literary scholar is in asking literary questions. It's an intellectual enterprise that has rules and practices of logic, evidence, argument, openness to ability to respond to challenges, and so on. And it is really essential, and I think Sudeep wasn't suggesting otherwise, that when we move forward in neuroscience in this country, or at our university, or at an agency in the government, that it be as informed by the ethics as by the empirical evidence, because as we discussed earlier, the two go hand in hand to make good science. Barbara and Steve.
Thanks. Mine is a question for Dr. Murray. You said you had recommendations you talk about later, and I know we heard one at least, maybe two, but I didn't want to lose that piece of what you had, because I think the experience is really probably important as a basis for what we're doing.
Thanks so much. I think I snuck them all in my answers, but what I'll do is I promise I'll work with the staff, and I'll also write them up for you. But I think you've heard pretty much everything I thought
That's
I
even
needed to
better.
say.
Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Hauser.
Yes, so I would also echo that what a great morning this was, and this I think highlights how animated we all get when we think about neuroscience and its implications. No offense to other disciplines, but this is particularly, I think, of interest to all of us. And I would also say that it's very clear, and we all understand that the deep answers that we're looking for are going to come from a bottom-up approach where we begin with simple systems. But a number of you also discussed short-term human opportunities, and Walter especially, and a number of people discussed the very terrible lack of significant progress with electroconvulsive therapy, for example, for treatment of depression, and the opportunities that technology development could give us in that area. You showed the lovely images of our ability to fiber track, map living brain, image molecules, etc. Surface brain grids that can help us better localize areas of abnormality. a number of computer-brain interfaces for sensory processing and also for motor output assistance. These all, and some cognitive enhancers, either working on function or plasticity. And these are all so interesting, I think, to all of us, but from a neuroscience perspective, are incremental changes. And my question is, are there transformational, short-term, tractable possibilities that this program will give us over the medium term that we should worry about as a bioethics commission?
Great question. Somebody here has got to at least venture a response. Dr. Wingfield?
I'll try. I think there have been some transformational advances, one being optogenetics and clarity, which I think has been a game changer. But you are quite right, there are other intractable problems right now, and one that came up earlier, I think, was actually working on theories of brain function. And one way at NSF we've tried to address these kinds of intractable problems is what's called an ideas lab, in which we bring people together who would not normally talk to one another and don't know each other, but are approaching the problem from different perspectives. To sit down, we have them, first of all, they surmount the barrier of talking the same language. We get them communicating with one another, and they begin to develop ways in which they might be able to address this problem. They actually start writing proposals. And also at the Ideas Lab, we have a panel that are provocateurs, and we'll criticize them. And over a period of 5 days, these are intense meetings. They come up, they form small groups, maybe 5 groups of 2 or 3 PIs with actual proposals of how they might address this intractable problem. One that we just did was nothing to do with neuroscience, but just to give you an idea of how intractable this problem is how to engineer crop plants that can fix their own nitrogen, which will increase crop productivity, feeding the world, but also will mitigate the need for nitrogen fertilizers. Huge problem. We just funded 3 grants through an eager mechanism to address that problem directly. And we have one coming up in March, which will be focusing on brain theories, theories of brain function, that we hope will do the same thing. And we fund them through what's called an EAGER grant, an early concept grant for exploratory research. So once we get that grant in, it's peer reviewed, we can fund it in 4 to 6 weeks. So that just gives you an example of how we're going to go about that.
So, Steve, there's one technology which is a little bit off the grid, not that well known, but I've been struck by the fact that it could be transformative in the short term, and that's what's called MR-focused ultrasound. So it's a technology that's now being used, so it's non-invasive stimulation of brain with ultrasound waves that can be targeted to a 1 millimeter spot. So Frank Ulez, who you might remember from the Brigham, was one of the pioneers. So they're currently using it to make lesions, but the really interesting part is that at energies below lesions, you can potentially either stimulate or shut off brain and potentially without undue harm to the nervous system. If that plays out, that opens up the ability to interrogate all deep structures in the brain, turning them on and off, seeing, in mental health conditions, does it, finding areas like Helen found just all over the brain. That would be the one thing that I think is a long shot, but I see as potentially really unbelievably short-term transformative.
So this is not an answer to your question, but an idea that was provoked by your question, which hasn't come out at all. And that is sort of the role of futuristic thinking and science fiction in the enterprise. I have one friend who, in the case of nanotechnology, interviewed scientists and engineers and actually used tried to get them to write science fiction stories that involve. So I just wanted to suggest that engineers and scientists are clearly problem solvers, but they also, I think, implicitly are going somewhere. You know, they're going. We're going somewhere in the future, and being able to tease out that futuristic thinking really does facilitate kind of the ethical issue. Even though the scenarios, you know, may not come to pass, it tells you a lot.
Well, this panel has certainly helped us think about where we may want to go in the near future. I don't know in the distant, but we really, without any reservation and very enthusiastically, thank you all for your input to the commission this morning. Thank you so very, very much.